and Lou on our team at New Holland and the whole gang at Major Brands for bringing me down. Dedicating time and energy to inviting more people to learn about beer is something that's really important. It's been this sort of attitude and approach and investment that has really helped change the landscape of beer over the last 15, 20 years. So I really appreciate you guys taking time to join us and appreciate you hosting it. So I thought what I'd do tonight is I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I was asked to talk about my own career and kind of my path in beer. When I start doing the numbers now, you know, my bones start to ache and I realize that I'm older than I think, because I've been in beer for about 24 years now. So it's been quite a path besides the work and the people that are in the beer industry and the spirits industry now. Besides all that, it's also been interesting to be able to see the change. So the beer market in 1991, the marketplace looked a lot different than it looks now in so many different ways. So I hope to share some of that experience with you tonight and just see, you know, kind of where we go. I also enjoy kind of the conversational aspect of these things. So if you have a question about something that I'm talking about, you can feel free to raise it during the conversation rather than waiting till the end. And of course, we'll have some time for questions at the end as well. But if you have a comment or question that comes up during this, especially when we get into tasting the beers, feel free to jump right in. So in the beginning, I got in the beer business. I'd started homebrewing as a hobby. My story is not of a homebrewer turned pro brewer, however, but homebrewing, I was a fan of beer, and a buddy of mine and I started homebrewing, and we're really excited by the fact that we could create flavor, that we could do it ourselves. We weren't really beer experts, I would say, but we were beer fans, and there was something that felt really underground about it. And in '91, it was pretty underground. It was less popular. We had to go what seemed like the far west side of Chicago at the time. Now it probably doesn't seem that far west, but there was one little home brew supply store in this shady building, and you had to buzz a buzzer, and a guy came out from the back room, and you know, he never had what was on our list, but he always subbed stuff, and I couldn't understand necessarily what he's doing, and it was just a very shady operation. I think that attracted us to it. And so we started making beer, and then I was in music school, and I was essentially carving a path to try to make it as a professional musician, and starting that career. And then he ended up getting a job with Guinness, representing Pilsner Urquell. So, long story short, he invited me to talk to his distributor. He said, "Oh, they're always looking for people that can sell beer. You could sell beer," and I had always thought of business as a threat to my creative pursuits, that if any day gig or regular job that I took had to be short term and nothing that I was going to put my heart into, because my heart was in music. And so I interviewed for the for this job at the distributor, and well, first when I called, he turned me down, and then I took a moment, got upset, and called him back and said, "Listen, I'm just asking for an interview." But anyways, I get this interview and talk my way into the job. And because I was in downtown Chicago, we had a lot of suppliers. So, and like what, New Holland is a supplier. What Lou and I do is what a lot of these people were doing that would come and visit me. So they'd go on my sales route for the day. And I got a window into this really interesting community. And I felt my job was to translate these beers for people. We had a list of about 150 different imports, big brands, little brands, in-between brands, but it was specialty beer, and at the time, specialty beer meant imports. There were a few microbreweries on the scene, but they were really, really small in terms of presence, and we didn't have any of them in our book at the time. And so really, specialty beer was a different sort of makeup than it is now. And again, I'm in downtown Chicago, and I'm talking to retailers, and I really started to take my job seriously, that these beers are never going to see the light of day if somebody doesn't taste them, understand them, and explain to somebody why this fits and what's interesting about it. And so that all of a sudden start to feel like a creative role, and that seeing all these suppliers showed me many different ways you could do the job. And the point there is that I started to understand I could relax this opinion I had that business was a threat to creativity, that really how you went about your job, and if you were trying to create, if you're trying to express ideas and you were being creative about how you brought, joy to people, that that you could kind of bring that to almost anything. And certainly a passion of mine, which was beer and brewing, and then learning that I had a natural aptitude for being able to help people understand beer, all really started to open my eyes. And I thought, okay, nobody told me this lived in the world of business. So my world started to blend a little bit, and I thought a career, I probably didn't think that seriously, like words career, but I thought maybe I'll go deeper into this. So I started looking for a role as a supplier to distributors rather than staying at the distributor. And I got one with Warsteiner Imports. So I sold Warsteiner, German beer, for a couple of years, and I really cut my teeth as a regional salesperson. Training was interesting in those days. It was basically a list of distributors in 9 states and go. So I started to really understand or work to learn the process of kind of regional sales, meeting distributors, being on the road, meeting people, helping people understand what our brand is and where our beer should be. And so that became a really big learning curve for me. And at the same time, I met, at the time, Larry Bell, because we sold beer to the same distributor in Chicago. And so in 1995, I moved on from Warsteiner and became the first sales manager at Kalamazoo Brewing Company, now known as Bell's Brewing Company. And so that was a whole path of, okay, I've got some skills. I learned how this business works. It's very important for these young microbreweries who typically had owners as their only salesperson. It's very important that we, as a brewery, we being at Bell's at the time, but I think it was very important, it was an opinion I still share, that breweries have to figure out how to speak distributor. They have to figure out how to speak retailer. They have to figure out how to represent their brand through the machinations of the industry and care for it, care for their information, for their message, for their product, for their relationships, all the way through. That having great beer and loading it on a truck at the end of the dock, your job is not done, your job is just beginning. And so I had a lot of passion for bringing the sales and kind of professional side to our effort at the time and to microbrewing as we were known then as well. And then at the same time, my home brewer brain kind of lit up, because all of a sudden on my team are all these really home brewers turned pro that made up our team, and we're around flavor, we can create things, and we were small and nimble and duct taped. So it was terrifying because we could have gone out of business at any moment. And it was thrilling because we could have gone out of business at any moment. And we were at the helm, so we could steer the company. And I don't know, I guess I was 25 or so at the time, I think. And so it was just a really exciting opportunity, filled with learning and filled with, as many hard times as there were good times. But, we believed that we were part of the movement of American breweries that were changing the landscape, and I think we did. There were some before us, and there were many after us, but that era of the 90s was a significant surge in claiming some of the marketplace for what's now known as craft. And so even in telling the story, it's interesting to go back, because I feel this obligation to change my terminology based on the year. And I think that's an interesting part of the story, that microbrewing is what we were known as, and it really designated size and approach, and as more people became familiar with it, and as some of those microbreweries grew up, it became important to talk about it differently. And microbrewing as a term was getting abused as well. It's confusing because it is sometimes a technical term and sometimes a descriptive term, meaning a state that was making adaptations so that you could pour beer to customers by the glass might create a microbrewer's license. So are you a microbrewery? Yes. And the state might have a different barrelage limit than what the Brewers Association was using for stats. And so the national limit was 15,000 barrels, but your state could be whatever. And then you had Sam Adams putting ads out that said the fastest growing microbrewery in the United States. And it's like, you're 800,000 barrels. You're not a microbrewery. And so all of that, I think, steered the community to kind of start using different terms, and craft really grew out of that. There's still debate in the industry about, the Brewers Association has a craft definition, and they really need to have one because they're managing data sets and reporting trends to major national, international publications. So they're a member organization. So they define craft as small and independent and traditional, and it includes breweries of 6 million barrels and under. Used to be 2. And that has grown, and so essentially that's Sam Adams and down. But once a brewery sells more than 25% of their ownership to a non-craft brewery or non-member, then they are no longer designated as craft by the Brewers Association. So whether the consumer views them as craft or their beer as craft is really up to the consumer, in my opinion, but that's just a little bit of a background on how that happened. And I get there just because I was kind of feeling it myself telling you stories, is that I think for the consumer, sometimes there can be confusion or gray area of, okay, when did we all start calling it craft beer and what does it mean? To me, it really grew out of microbrewing becoming less and less appropriate because it only really designated size. So we have a beer. This is Mad Hatter. This is one of the very early beers for us as a brewery. It's an IPA. It's really a showcase for Centennial hops. It has some updates in the past 12 months. I guess last spring we updated a little bit. It's about 7%. It's very aromatic. We also consider it a Midwest IPA, not only because there's some Michigan-grown Cascades in this beer, but also because we look at a Midwestern IPA as having a nice malt backbone, a nice balance between malt and assertive hopping, and really dynamic aromatics. So you're going to get some citrus in the nose. You'll get some nice malt body, and I think lively bitterness. So, and that's great. And with IPAs, be sure to give this a little swirl and a little smell. It's dry hopped, and so you're really going to get those aromatics that are reminiscent of fresh hops, and the aroma is so much part of your tasting experience. And in these beers, it's really a huge part of the experience. We tasted this beer with an 8-year-old cheddar last night. It was delicious. I think IPAs and this beer in particular, you can accentuate the citrus, you can accentuate the herbaceousness. There's a lot of different ways you can go. But if you're looking at foods, think about places where you like herbs and places where you like lemon. So some simple things come to mind for me, like, herb roasted poultry. You put a lemon in the center of your chicken with a herb bundle. That's lemon and herbs. That's going to really accentuate some of the nice aromatics in this beer. So I do encourage people to think broadly when thinking about pairing, that it's not always about rules. It's getting into this sense of flavor and thinking about what does this remind me of and where else do I find those flavors? And that'll really give you a little bit of your own sensory roadmap to think about putting things together. This is going to also be fun against a little bit of heat. Hoppy beers can accentuate spicy heat, but it can also cleanse it. So it kind of depends on the intensity level and what the dish is and what else is going on. But I find that against mild heat that this is really pleasant, frames it nicely. So this is a beer we've made, I think, since 1997, which is the first year that we were open. And it's been really fun to kind of, back then, this is a great kind of segue back to the old home week, the story time, I guess, in that I remember in the mid-'90s, IPAs were specialty beers. They weren't the hallmark that they are now. Breweries had an amber ale, typically at every brewery you went to. They typically had a pale ale and a stout, an India pale ale and the dry hopped big IPA. That was maybe a single batch release. Maybe not every brewery had it. And then they really started to pop up more and more. I would say by the end, by 2000, they were becoming more of a staple. But if you look at, the history of brewing and the history of beer styles, for a style to kind of come out of nowhere and now be the benchmark that every brewery has maybe a couple of sometimes, that happened in 15 years. That's pretty remarkable. Yes, sir.
Talk about the difference between an APA and an IPA.
Sure. So the question is the difference between an APA, an American Pale Ale, and an IPA, which is a India Pale Ale. So I imagine a lot of you know the story of India Pale Ale. It's named after the beer that was over-hopped to make the voyage from England to India. So hops are a natural preservative. They are, they're bitter and acidic, and so they are a hostile environment for bad things. And so they would over-hop beer to make that journey in the, hull of a boat. And then that kind of had a resurgence as it was brought back by, mostly, I don't know if I have the history exactly right here, but mostly American brewers were the ones that started to showcase that and bring it back. An American Pale Ale so IPAs are typically dry hopped and typically very assertive in both their bitterness and hop flavor. So, the bitterness is measured scientifically in bitterness units and is a certain impact on your palate. The flavor from hops are often associated with bitterness, and they're often interwoven, but it can be different. So you can get the flavor without all the bitterness based on how you use the hops. Same with aroma. Anyways, American Pale Ales are typically less intense. They may or may not be, but are usually lower in alcohol. And nowadays, they're getting dry hopped more often, but I would say that my impression and understanding is I don't necessarily expect a pale ale to be dry hopped. I do expect an IPA to be dry hopped. And anybody not familiar with dry hopping? Okay, so dry hopping is a technique that is adding the hops at the tail end of fermentation, and you're soaking them in the beer. And so you're not heating them. The hops are typically brought in the boil, and you bring them at different points for whether you're and you can bring different varietals in at the different points, or you can have the same hop at different points, but you're affecting bitterness and flavor, and then at the tail end, aromatics. Well, dry hopping is solely aromatics because you're not heating it, so it's going to have a different impact, and it's all aroma. So that smell you get from this is really driven from our dry hopping technique. So pale ales typically don't do that, and they're going to be a little bit more mild in both flavor and bitterness. Thank you. Oh yeah. So see if I get this story right. So also, I came to the brewery in 2004. It was founded in 1997 by Brett Vanderkamp, who's current president, co-founder, and then I came a little bit later. But so Brett was putting this beer on tap for a group that was coming into the pub. In our hometown, Holland, Michigan, there's Hope College there. And so I don't think I'll get the names right, but the poetry English professor at Hope College was bringing a summer term group into the pub and to have a little party. And so Brett was putting this beer on tap for him, and it was Mad Hatter Day. So if you remember in Alice in Wonderland, the illustration of the Mad Hatter, there's a tag in his hat that says, "In this style, 10-6." So there's different lore around that, and nobody has ever really pinned down what it means, but one of the theories is that it's an English date, so that would be the 10th of June. And so a lot of people celebrate June 10th as Mad Hatter Day, including this group of English majors. And so so they, of course, rallied and suggested that the beer be Mad Hatter, and thus it is, and history went on. And, far be it from us to challenge anybody who thinks it's a good idea to have a party. So I think that's what the hat means. I think I saw your hand going up over here. The man in the hat may have some other lore to add to that. You have another story?
10-6 means a half a guinea. A guinea is 21 shillings. A pound is 20 shillings. The guineas are gold. You pay your accountant in pounds. You pay your haberdasher, your hatter, in guineas. And so a half a guinea is 10-6. So it's 10.
Well, all I know, so half a guinea is 10-6, and that's a great story. But I don't see any people around the world having parties over it. So I'm going with June 10th. But I appreciate the historical contribution. Yep, you can party twice a year. So we celebrate our anniversary now with Hatter Days, which is a collection of events over the course of the second weekend of June, typically near the 10th. And we produce some beers in the summer Hatter Day series, so you'll see a few different hatters come out. And we'd like to have parties throughout our markets celebrating our anniversary. And it's really all around this beer, which is kind of the first beer to break for us in a significant way. All right, so this next beer is the Poet, and this is an oatmeal stout. How many stout drinkers do we have in the room? All right, this is the right room to be in. So stouts are going to feature dark roasted malts. The barley is going to present a lot of different flavors that are reminiscent of coffee and chocolate. Of course, you can add those ingredients. In this case, we have not. We're just expressing those flavors from dark roasted malted barley. And so this is a beer that's year-round for us. It continues to grow dramatically, and I love it this time of year. It's always strong in the winter, and then it keeps trudging on right into spring and summer, and it always surprises us. I guess it's not a surprise anymore, but what I love about this, an oatmeal stout, is a variation on a stout in that it's bringing oats in. Seems simple enough. And what do oats, bring? What do we think of when we think about oatmeal? There's a creaminess. There's a kind of a richness. There's a smoothness to it. The mouth feels a little different. So I think it's a great balancing act because you can have all the roast that you want. The stout lovers have plenty of depth and roast character, but it's softened and it brings this mouthfeel that really invites a lot more people, I think, to enjoy this beer. Really good food beer as well. Of course, it's a natural with chocolates or against dairy. So I like this with soft ripened cheeses, really rich soft cheeses. I like it with, dessert with vanilla ice cream or things like that. And it's also really good with beef and mushrooms. So there's an earthiness to this. There's a kind of nice natural umami character that'll come out when you bring this to other earthy flavors, especially mushrooms. Like the favorite dish I like to do is you make a mushroom duxelle, which is basically mushrooms and cream and onions, and then you layer that between crepes, and you make this cake that's layered crepe, mushroom, and then you cut a wedge of that, serve it with this beer, and it's just delicious. Yes, sir. That is in the book. Another question? Okay, great. I thought I heard something. Yes, sir.
So like stouts and porters, they always seem to have bigger flavor as they warm up. Is that also the same thing with cellar aging as well? So while you put it in the cellar and keep them, does that flavor build over time as well?
So the question is about temperature and whether stouts are going to open up or flavors increase in intensity as it warms up. And then a second part of that question was about vintaging beer. So yes, the flavors are going to open up as it warms up. And these beers are, especially if you love the flavors, if you like the bigger flavors, as they come up from, say, 33, 35 degrees where a cooler might be, and as they get into the low 40s and mid 40s, they're going to be very expressive. And a well-made stout is going to do very well at that temperature. I consider that kind of cellar temperature, and I really enjoy it. Of course, when people ask me what temperature beer should be served at, I tell them whatever the hell the customer wants. Because I think if you like your beer cold, you like your beer cold. If you like to warm it up, you can warm it up. When in this country, you know, and in Europe, there's a little different standards, and there's higher temperature as a rule for draft beer for certain styles. But here, you know, you're not going to have a lot of choices. Your refrigerator is going to be set at what it's set. So if you're storing bottles, it's going to be cold. If you're pouring draft beer in a bar, unless they're doing cask beer and unless they have a separate cooler for their cask beer, your beer is going to be cold. And so, I'm not challenging that. I'm saying that that's efficient service. And how that relates is that it's in the customer's hands. You know, you can get a glass of beer and you know, you cup the snifter in your hands and let it sit for a little bit. Order ahead if you want to have, especially later when we get into dragon's milk is a great example of this. If you want to order dragon's milk for dessert and you like it at 45 degrees, order it when you order your entree. So it really ends up being the customer's world in terms of managing their beer temperature. Vintaging beer is a whole nother question, and typically flavors don't build in vintaging beers. They tend to recede. And vintaging beer is a question mark. And I say that just because it's a little bit of buyer beware. Everybody's got to be mindful of how they are gauging their beer in their cellar, or else it can go right past its sweet spot where it should have been drank and head into not so pleasant beer, and it didn't get opened, and that can be unfortunate. So the concept to think about for vintaging beer is you want some alcohol, you want stronger beers, and typically you want malt-forward beers. Hops do not age very well. They're the first thing to degrade and first thing to kind of show oxidation poorly. Now, there are some exceptions, and there are people that are aging hoppy beers, and some of them are pretty unique and interesting with some age on them, but it's a gamble. They're going to be the first thing that show age poorly. And the second part, or maybe, you know, part 1A, is that degradation, I mean, the beer is degrading, technically. So when you ask a lab person, a quality control person about aging beer, you tend to like see them get visibly uncomfortable because they know that the beer is at its best from a technical standpoint right when it hits the package or even just before. But it just so happens that a lot of these beers show this degradation gracefully. So they're big. The bigger the beers that have complex flavors that are going to marry over time or relax over time, the big beers that are edgy, you know, maybe they taste great fresh, but they are pretty edgy. They're alcohol forward. They're really robust. Those are beers that, as this natural oxidation happens, those flavors start to mellow and the edges start to soften, and the distinct couple of flavors in there might start to blend from being distinct and identifiable components into this softened curve that you start to lose the line between these two different components. So I think that can make some of the robust beers really, really beautiful. And it's just important to know that you're going down a line where eventually that will start to be less graceful and start to maybe there will be an end point. And so it sounds like salesmanship, but it isn't. I mean, I recommend buy a case, not a bottle, or a six-pack, not a bottle. So that way, every year you can open one, and you can start to see the curve yourself. And typically, it still means most of your consumption is going to happen after the sweet spot, because the only way you know it stopped getting better is that it got a little worse. But you're catching it, right? So you see that curve, and you say, all right, I've enjoyed this every year. I think it was at its best last time I tasted it, so that means I know what we're serving at Thanksgiving. We're going to drink it this year. And so that will also educate your own palate in terms of what the impacts of age. And so taste, open the beers in your cellar, people. Drink it regularly. And then you can decide for yourself which beers you liked with age on them. I like this one with 2 years, seemed to be the sweet spot. You learn that 1 year, and now you know next year that's probably going to be the case, et cetera, et cetera. But just socking it away and not looking at it for 5 years is just going to give you old, tired beer.
If it's hoppy, probably don't age it.
Drink hoppy beers fresh.
Something that's very boozy, when you first get it, you're going to age better.
Boozy, bold, malt-forward beers age well. And not only will the alcohol help it, but you're also talking about complex bodies that will benefit from age. Because it's not just will it make it. Vodka will store well, but we don't age it because it's not going to change. So there's no point in it. And so think about something that's going to benefit from the change. And then see if you like it. So I'll tell two stories now, a little bit about this beer and about the beer that inspired the program that allowed this beer to happen. So I guess it was about 2006, we made our first sour beer. So we had been barrel aging for a while, since 2001. So we knew a little bit about barrels, and we had some barrels around. And typically with barrels, you're trying to prevent off flavors from developing. So this means for us, we'll get into it on the next beer, I think, but we're going to barrel age at refrigerated temperatures so that the bacteria and the yeast that might be hiding in the wood is inactive. This way we're going to be able to get the wood flavors, but not have sour flavors that can develop from when the bacteria and the yeast find the sugar. So souring beer is the exact opposite. You're looking for wild organisms, bacteria and wild yeast that are going to create acidic flavors, and you want them to be active, so you store it warm, and you break all the rules, all the things that you prevent from being in your normal cellar, you encourage in a sour cellar. So we made a beer called Moxie, and we made about 400 bottles of it, and swiftly received a cease and desist from Moxie Soda Company. We were, because we only had 400 bottles and like a roll of labels, it was humorous to us at the time, because cease and desist is easy when the beer's already gone. We, as a young brewery, we were kind of just impressed that the PR had gotten that far that quickly. So anyways, the next year we continued the sour beer program with a beer called Blue Sunday, which is now on tap at Cicero's. We just bottled this year's batch. And Blue Sunday is a beer we do every January, and it's a sour beer that's become part of a relatively robust sour program. And we don't have it in the class today, but I do recommend you try it. I think there's only a couple kegs in St. Louis, is that right? Three. One of them's here.
Yeah, only one of them is here. The 3 kegs in the state of Missouri.
Three kegs in the state of Missouri.
22 cases of 22, so they strongly recommend that you taste it here. And you'll find it.
So I'm teasing you a little bit because I haven't talked about this beer in our glass yet, but how many people are sour beer fans? And how many people don't find they like it or it's not for them? All right, so pretty good mix. Well, what I want to talk about a little bit is an invitation for everybody to try it, including those that love it and including those that don't. Because sour beer gets a little bit of a bad rap, in my opinion, because it starts out with the word sour, and then it has some negative connotations. Would you like to smell this milk? I think it's sour. No. We have natural, involuntary responses to that. We feel it in our body before we've even thought through it, like we're backing away before the sentence is finished. And so sour has some culinarily some natural resistance. But tartness and acidity, how do those relate culinarily? We use tartness and acidity all the time. We love vinegar. We love lemon juice. We are using acidity to balance sweetness left and right. Our palates are very familiar with tartness and very familiar with acidity. So when you think of it in those terms, the beer can feel much less off-putting just by changing your thoughts about terminology. And when you start thinking about where do we like this tartness, then that will also perhaps change your perspective. We had it last night with some rich charcuterie, some St. Louis-made charcuterie and fennel salami from Volpe. And it was really nice interplay. The salt brought out some of the sweetness in the beer, and the acidity really cut the fat, and it's just delicious on a charcuterie plate. And what do you see in a traditional plate of charcuterie with the pate and the rillette and the salami or what have you? Pickled onions, fruit chutney, acidic, bright, fruit, counterpoint, cleanse. So that's a way to think about sour beers. rather than, I don't know, that seems a little off. Think about it as cleansing counterpoint and bright, refreshing acidity, and the world may change. Now, Mischievous is a beer that is in our sour cellar program because it includes wild yeast, which is a similar process. It's something that we don't want in our normal fermentation cellar, and it's something that's it's Brettanomyces is a wild yeast, and it's we call this a wild ale rather than a sour ale, which is still maybe bending the words a little bit because it's in a controlled environment, and we're dosing it with a specific known strain versus being in Belgium and opening our windows. But we call it wild instead of sour because there's decidedly less tartness. This is not going to have the same impact as some of the other bacteria that make Blue Sunday and Incorrigible or other sours. So this is Mischievous, and it's 100% Brett. We had 2 stainless batches that were in stainless tanks that we then blended together. And when you taste this, there's some wild sort of minerality, and there's a little bit of fruit, and there's a little bit of what people would say is barnyard, or I often don't know what everybody is, I have horses in a barn, so like I get it, but I wonder how useful is that descriptor. But I do think there's some kind of wild minerality and just kind of funk to it, but it's not necessarily as tart. So I would put this against less intense foods than I would put a sour beer. And you think about some of the, one way to think about this flavor that, is almost indistinct. It's not super clear. It's this kind of wandering, funky flavor that you can kind of pick up different things on different sips is, I love like the soft or the kind of medium-bodied white cheeses that have just a little bit of funk to them. They smell a little bit like a sock, but they don't quite taste like socks. But you get that kind of minerality in those cheeses, and they're not super strong. This reminds me of those cheeses. Taleggio is an Italian version that's really good, and I think that you bring this in, you pair that with some fruit, like some apple and some Taleggio in this beer, and it's going to drink like a Sauvignon Blanc might drink. It's going to be pleasant, and it's going to provide some counterpoint, and the funk seems less funky and just seems like depth. So that's Mischievous. And there seems to be an ongoing debate about Mischievous versus Mischievous. And I think I'm losing the debate, but there's no I after the V. What are the letters after the V? O-U-S. Us. Mischievous. That's a grammar lesson for today. So that's kind of our sour program. I'm not sure where I left off history-wise, other than that we've continued to grow, and we started in one combined building in 1997. Combined meaning production and pub were the same layered space. The bottling line ran into the pub. They'd kind of fold up part of the in-feed out of the pub, come close by the end of the day so that people could drink. And then in 2002, a building opened up downtown, this little nice shopping district in downtown Holland. It was a hardware store, the Vogelsang hardware store. And so we moved the pub, which is now Pub on 8th. We opened a few hundred-seat pub there, and so that left the old building to production. Of course, the air-conditioned dining room made a great bottle warehouse. So you can kind of imagine the growth of kind of, you work with what you have. The pub has been wildly successful and has grown from that point. And then a few short years later, in 2006, we moved the production facility. We had an opportunity to buy a bottling line that we bought from Summit Brewing. It was a bottling line that had heritage because they bought it from Sierra, and Sierra bought it from Rolling Rock. So it was this American history bottling line that was bigger. The footprint was bigger than any clear space we had in our building. So, and we bought it ahead of its decommissioning at Summit. So we had, I don't know, 9 months to a year or so, and it was an interesting deal when you purchase a piece of equipment that you know requires a building. It's like, okay, where are we going to put it? I don't know, but we'll find someplace. And so we did find a place. We moved our production operation a little bit north, on the north side of Holland. It's now grown into probably, we probably have combined 75 or 80,000 square feet of space. The building that the brewery's in is about 50, and that bottling line has seen lots of renovations, and lots of its pieces have been replaced or modified, but it's still cranking. And we have a big barrel cellar there where we age dragon smoke, this next beer that's coming out. And what else? We started distilling in 2005, so we're going to taste some spirits here at the end of the beer. So that's exciting. And we've just kind of continued to pursue creative ideas and really follow our mission. And I think we focus a lot on mission and vision and values internally at our company, and I'm proud of that. And I'm also proud that our mission is something that means something to us versus kind of that mission statement that just gets put in a handbook somewhere and never looked at again. And our mission is, paraphrased, is that we exist to improve, enhance people's lives with by creating remarkable experiences. So we really believe that what we do matters, and that the work we do is to put beautiful things out in the world for you guys to enjoy. And if we're not doing that, we're not on our path. We're off mark. So it's not about how big we can get. It's not about how fast we can be. It's about, are we making people happy, and are we proud of the work we're doing? So cheers to making people happy. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If you speak into your glass, it does not amplify your voice. This is a public speaking lesson brought to you by me. Yes, sir. How do the locals take it because Holland is a religious town is the question. Well, I'll tell you that that's partly in our name. When Brett and Jason, was a partner, co-founder of the brewery, and he was on board until, I think, 05, 06. And then he left and went around and did a few different things, and then later opened Brewery Vivant. So just a little history there. But when Brett and Jason, they both went to Hope College. They both left town. They came back and started talking about making a brewery together. And a lot of people questioned, why would you put a brewery in Holland? It is a conservative town. It has a religious history and some undertones. In fact, Blue Sunday, I forgot to mention that the name of that sour beer was named when we still could not sell beer and spirits on Sunday because of blue laws. Now it's a testament to the fact that we changed those laws. So we're happy about that. And I think, this is partly what I love about the New Holland story, and what drew me to want to be part of it, is that the idea of there's no breweries in Holland, there's no real beer culture, food and drink culture is a little bit challenged by this old reputation, was very much the inspiration of talking about, well, that's why it needs a brewery. And that's why we need to start working on forming a New Holland, and talking about what the future can be and contributing to that instead of walking away. So our pub has floor-to-ceiling glass windows on the front-facing wall that goes right to 8th Street, this little walking shopping district. And it may not seem like anything now, but you go back to 2002 or you go back to 97 when the brewery opened, and that's kind of a big statement to say, we're going to brew beer, we're going to make spirits, and we're going to drink in downtown Holland. And I'm happy to say that I think it's a very warm and welcoming community. It has that history, and it has it for a reason. But present-day Holland has a lot of people embracing a lively culture, and food and drink is part of it. So our district that we're in has lots of bars and restaurants and events and festivals, and so we're glad to be kind of part of the changing landscape. I think you've seen that across America, that food and drink, especially drinking, that breweries and pubs have reminded us something that we knew 100 years ago, is that the meeting place, the pub as a meeting place, as a community gathering place, is really essential to neighborhoods and essential to community. And I think there was a period of time where the pub was looked at as a late night bar where troublemakers hung out, and we started to shove them out of the way. We started to get them out of the center of neighborhoods, and that's not helpful. I think we need gathering places, and we come together, we share ideas, and we gain bonds by meeting over a drink, meeting over a meal. And so I'm all for recognizing food and drink as a cultural contributor rather than a negative. So we have Dragon's Milk in front of us, and this is a bourbon barrel stout. This is a beer that we started making in 2001. This is not a beer that existed prior to the barrel, meaning we didn't have this beer as a stout and then say, let's make a barrel-aged version of it. Brett really engineered this beer as, I want to make some barrel-aged beer. I'm going to design a beer that is appropriate for the barrel. So there's nice rich tones of chocolate and coffee here. What you get from the wood, we're using bourbon barrels. So you're going to pick up some sweetness from the bourbon, some actual bourbon character, which is round and sweet and rich and a little boozy. But you're also going to pick up oak flavor. Now, we don't grow up chewing on oak chips. So when you say oaky, unless you're experienced with drinking oak-aged beverages, your tongue doesn't necessarily know what to think about that. So oak is going to bring vanilla character. There's vanilla flavor profiles inside the oak. It's charred oak, so it's going to bring a toastiness as well. And that's a little secret weapon for pairing with food, is that oak-aged beers go really well with smoked foods. They have a kinship. They both know burnt wood. And it may not be really like primary flavors in your mind when you're tasting them, but I kid you not, it works every time. So bring oak-aged beers next to smoked foods, and there's some sort of family reunion that happens, and it's a fun one. Anyways, so you get vanilla from the oak. You sometimes pick up a little coconut, especially if it's influenced by a pairing, or if you think about it, or if somebody tells you to think about coconut while they're on the microphone. But that's a little bit more of a secondary, subtle flavor that is sometimes perceived and sometimes not. But we really look for, this is a program that's developed a great deal for us. This has gone from a single batch a year to then we tried making 4 batches a year, and then we started making it once a month. And we've continually invested in what it takes to make barrel-aged beer, which is square footage, refrigerated cellar, sterile filtration, blending tanks, all this stuff. It's very difficult to do year-round. It's very difficult to do in volume. We do both. We like to call it the unlimited release. And it's a beer that we are very intentional about having it be a blend, having the bourbon flavors, the wood flavors, and the malt flavors, thank you, all present. So we're blending first and second use barrels. Our guys are tasting every batch. We're making a consistent, flavorful, balanced beer out of an inherently inconsistent process. For Dragon's Milk, yes. And then we can use them again after that, but not for Dragon's Milk. Yep. So we blend first and second use barrels, which is really second and third if you think about it. The first use was bourbon. But for us, first use is when it comes from the distillery, a distillery. And so this is a beer that's really kind of made a national name for itself, and it's available year-round in all markets, which is now 28 states, and we're really proud of it. Hope you're enjoying it. This is great with, it's very similar food descriptors to the Poet. It's just a little bit more intense, so it can handle more robust foods. But again, dessert, it's great with caramel, with dairy, with chocolate, with pastry, all over the place. It's great with beef and mushrooms. It's great with blue cheese. Just about. It's a shapeshifter. It can really go anywhere. It's a very unique food beer in that regards. Breakfast? Absolutely.
Great on a Sunday morning for football. They run in my house.
So that's Dragon's Milk. The dark one. All right. You know, not to be too generalizing or anything, but this is one of my favorite beers to introduce to wine drinkers. Oftentimes they're females, but women love beer too. But when you're at a food event, and especially if it's a beer and wine combo event, it's very common to get a couple come up, and the guy likes beer and the woman likes wine, and oh no thanks, I don't drink beer. And I think this is just an interesting little sidebar, is that I think so many people get this wrong when they try to introduce, when they invite someone to try beer that says they don't like beer. First, well, there's a couple ways you can do it wrong. And I don't like telling people they're doing stuff wrong, but occasionally, this is one of those times. That first of all, I don't like trying to convince people to like beer. I think it has to be an invitation. So if you guys are amongst friends that aren't as enthusiastic as you are obviously enthusiastic, you're at beer school. But if you have friends in your circle that aren't beer drinkers, invite them in, don't tell them they have to. The second part is that they think, well, you don't like beer, so I better get the lightest beer possible so that we can start you simple. We're going to start in the simple steps. Well, if you think about this from a palate point of view, rather than, beer is not a level, it's not a video game with levels where light beer is level 1 and dark beer is level 2. Think about your palate and what you're familiar with. We tend to know what we like and build on things we like. The neighbor flavors to what we already like are going to be likely next. And so for somebody who hasn't drank beer for years or at all, and maybe the first time they had it, it was some mass-produced light beer, and we give them the lightest beer we have, which has slight bitterness and some kind of pale breadiness. What else in their diet do they eat or drink that is like it? Cheerios and rice cakes. Would you like to share my Cheerios and rice cakes? I'm good. But if you talk to that drinker and say, do you like red wine, coffee, and chocolate? I think most people like red wine, coffee, and chocolate, or at least coffee and chocolate. When they like those flavors, you have some adjacent flavors to work with now. So now you have Dragon's Milk. It has a tannin structure that's going to be reminiscent of red wine and oakiness. It has coffee and chocolate flavors in its malt profile. So you see people who swear they don't like beer drinking an 11% barrel-aged stout saying, oh my God, I didn't know beer did this. And that to me is when the light goes on and you start to realize, yes, beer is wider than you knew it, and it has flavors that are similar to things you already like. Come on in, the water's fine.
I'm going to share a quick story of childhood real quick. I did a charity event with Dragon's Milk for Backstoppers, and which is an organization that supports the family members, firemen, and policemen that are deceased. And we just supported Dragon's Milk that night. The other brewery sponsor.
Spirits add on to the class. Welcome to Spirits class, Spirit School. So this is Barrel Bourbon, and it does have a nice tie into beer. We started distilling in 2005. We started distributing those spirits in 2008. This spirit came later and was kind of inspired by the Scotch tradition of looking for different barrels to age your spirit in. So they might sherry age their Scotch, for instance, or sometimes use bourbon barrels. And so we have a lot of beer barrels on hand with the development of Dragon's Milk, which has become our lead brand, by the way. And so we thought, what would happen if we put bourbon in Dragon's Milk barrels? So the first instance, we bought some bourbon. There's kind of a spirits market where distilleries can buy spirits from one another. And so there's a little bit of a market for that. And it's interesting because if you want to experiment in the spirits world and you say, I'd like to try that idea, let's lay down some bourbon, and in 2 or 3 years, we're going to then age it in a barrel. So instead, we were able to get finished bourbon, age it in Dragon's Milk barrels, and see what happened. And when we tasted it, we were both tasting for what proof what level of proof to make it and how long to hold it in the barrel. We just really loved it. What you'll find is that you'll get some kind of notes of cocoa and a little bit of that malt roastiness, and I think it really rounds the corners of the bourbon. It kind of just it brings some body and depth and smoothness to it, and really, I think, lessens the perception of heat, that it just seems less, it's robust and it's strong, but it seems it has a little less of that burn to me. And that is coming from the beer barrel aging. And then immediately we started making our own bourbon as well. And so it has been a combination of sourced and made bourbon over the years. Right now, we're tracking to be 100% of our own bourbon in our own Dragon's Milk beer barrels by the end of the year. And right now, we're about 80% our bourbon mixed with 20% sourced bourbon, and it's become our lead spirit.